Hello everyone and welcome to SmartCode. Now today in this tutorial you are going to learn how to work with CSS Id Selector, and we will also discuss the use and the role of Id Selector in web development. So in this tutorial I am going to use this simple HTML document that contains a div with some anchor tag and a paragraph tag. Now in web development, IDs have different usage. For example, in lengthy web page, you can use IDs to move from one page section to another page section. And JavaScript uses IDs to locate and manipulate the content of a web page. And of course, you can use IDs for CSS style selectors. So the use of IDs for CSS style selectors we are going to cover in this tutorial. Are you ready? So let's check it out. Now, in order to create and style your web page using CSS Id selectors, the first thing that you need to do is create IDs and assign them to HTML elements. And for creating an ID, we use ID attribute. Let's say I want to give an ID to the div, so I will write ID attribute first and then give it a value. So this value navigation is basically ID name, and the same I will do to the paragraph and apply an ID to it using ID attribute. So we have created two different IDs, right? Navigations and copyright. Now here you need to consider one thing. IDs must be unique on a page. This means you cannot overload ID names and assign same ID to any other tag. So IDs work opposite to the classes. If you have experience of the classes, then you know one class can be used for multiple elements, and one element can have more than one class attached to it, right? Now, once you have created the IDs, then you will go inside the CSS file and create ID selectors. So an ID selector starts with a hash character. We write first hash character and then the name of the ID we want to style, like navigation. And the same I will do for targeting the other ID. So this is how we create IDs and ID selectors. So now our ID selectors are ready and we can write some styling rules to style the elements holding these IDs. So let's write some rules. Let's now save the file and check the output. And there it is. Our ID selectors are working fine, right? Our div now has got light green background and a width of 722 pixels, and the paragraph which has copyright ID has got yellow color. So creating IDs and ID selectors is not so difficult, right? Let's now talk a bit about the ID selectors. As you know, you can style a page using either class selector or ID selector. But the question is, which one do you prefer? Or in what situation? And the answer is very simple. The rule of thumb is you should ask yourself, is there more than one element which requires the same style now or at any time in the future? If the answer is yes, then go for and choose class selectors. And if the answer is no, then you can go for ID selector. Another considerable thing is that the web design community does not encourage the use of CSS ID selectors, and there are some reasons for that. For instance, like I said earlier, IDs must be unique on a page, and that means if you attach a style to an ID, then you won't be able to reuse it within the same page. However, you can achieve the same result using classes. And the advantage of using classes is that they can be reused. Another reason is that IDs are used intensively by JavaScript, and most of the programmers use only classes to define styles and use IDs for other purposes, like giving JavaScript access to HTML elements or creating page anchor or to link labels to form fields. Another considerable thing is specificity. A class specificity is lower than ID specificity, and that means a class on its own cannot override any style belonging to an ID. And if you want to override, then you either need more IDs or to use important rule, and it will just begin a specificity war in your style sheet. Now, if you're a beginner and don't know much about the specificity, just forget it. You will learn more about it as you continue to work with the CSS and advance your knowledge. And finally, I would say I did not mean you shouldn't use CSS ID selectors. ID selectors are completely valid to use in CSS style sheet, and there is no major issue in using IDs together with the classes. You understand your code and the context of your problem better than anyone else. And if you think it makes sense to write CSS with IDs, then my suggestion is go ahead and use them. Right? So that was all about the CSS ID selectors, and I hope you like this tutorial, and thanks for watching.